So we're going to take a look at Heart of Darkness prompt that you did last Tuesday. And I just want to kind of go through the whole setup as to what I'm looking for, how they get scored, how are they different from like your take-home essays, like such as the Grapes of Wrath and whatnot. To make sure that we're clear on a couple things, I also have the writing scale on here, which is coming from page 18 and 19 of your course syllabus. I only put the one page up on the board. I think it runs from 9 down to the 5, so there would still be scores for 4, 3, 2, 1, and things like that. Your Heart of Darkness essays were very good. I was pleasantly surprised. Not saying I thought they'd be terrible, but it was nice for, hey, first essay getting submitted, this is pretty good. This isn't meant to crush your dreams or let you know that they really weren't that good. I did kind of beef up the scores a little bit. So if your essay got a score of a 7, in reality, it would have been more like a 6. I raised them up one number, one full level. So in the grade book, you got a 6% increase. That's not for Allie now to have self-doubt. I don't even remember what her score was. Of, oh my goodness, it wasn't a 6+, it was only a 5+. The world is coming down and terrible. Don't go into Chicken Little syndrome, because of this. Your Grapes of Wrath essays, the formal ones that you submit, will also get a small bump. So I score it. I see it as being a 7. It would show up then as being a 7-8. So it'll get like a little 2%. After that, it is what it is basically going to be, the way that they're graded. The couple reasons, your first TWA, you didn't really know about it. I mean, well, you knew about it by the time 7th period rolled around. But it wasn't something that was previously announced. It was the first writing assignment, so I put in a little buffer to kind of help out with some things. Grapes of Wrath essay, it's your first take-home essay. First time you're submitting like a formal one, so there's a little 2% cushion there. But after that, it'll kind of be what it is. When it comes to the scoring, one important thing to recognize is on an AP scale, on an AP exam, only the bold numbers are actual scores. So on an AP essay, and this gets confusing because we talk about AP exams, you get a 1, a 2, a 3, or 4, or 5. AP essays, you can get up to a 9. You would get a 5, you would get a 6, you would get a 7. You would not get a 5 minus or a 5 plus, 6 minus, 6 plus. I put those things in just to give me a little bit more flexibility when it comes to your grades. Otherwise, everything would be a 76 or an 82 or an 88. And if, Jake has a 6 and Justin has a 6, but Justin's 6 is better than Jake's 6, then that should get rewarded within the grade system and whatnot. So plus minus gives me a little flexibility with that. 6+ would be my way of saying it's a 6, but you are very close to getting to that next level of a 7. 6- would be my way of going it's a 6. So I'm not taking anything away from that, but you're getting pretty close to going into that 5 kind of category with it.
So on the AP exam, if we get a plus, would they generally put you up or put you down? Or does it just depend on who's looking at it?
They are, and we'll talk more about the grading process throughout. They're, number one, they're pretty consistent with it, so there shouldn't be too many instances of it depending who would look at it. It would have no difference. Like, it will be a 6 no matter what. They're not going to go strong 6. They're not going to go weak 6. It will just be a 6. So not really to that first part. If I'm not going to pretend that every single AP reader is going to grade the same way or score the same way that I would. So, should I give something a 6+? Yeah, there's a chance they might give it a 5 or a 7, but pretty confident that it would still end up being in that 6 range. But you're not going to have a strong 6, weak 6. And quite honestly, you're not even going to know what you got. You're going to get an AP exam score of a 3, 4, 5. You'll have no idea what you got on each essay. You'll have no idea what you got on multiple choice. It's unfortunate, but that's just, I don't know what you got on each essay.
At any point, will you grade us like that? Like just 6, 7?
It has happened before, probably not. I think it ends up being counterproductive. But just, if there's not, just know, I guess, that there's not really a whole lot of variation among those 3 scores. And quite honestly, like, say you got a 6 on your TWA. Sometimes it's minor changes that take it up into the 8 category. Like it's not, well, you make a whole bunch of changes, you could then get a 7. Or then you make a whole bunch more changes, you could then get an 8. The difference between a 6 and an 8 might not be all that big. And the anchor scores, like the main scores that an AP reader initially looks at, is going to be the 6, the 8, and then also the 2 and the 4. Those are the anchor scores. So if I read an essay, I start asking myself a couple questions. Number one, does it pass? If it passes, that means it's going to be 5 or higher. If it's in the 4s or lower, it does not pass. That particular prompt. Doesn't mean it does not pass the exam, but a 4 plus for us, would be considered a non-passing essay. Number one, does it pass? Then I go, if it does pass, is this effective or is this adequate? If I'm going, you know what, this is an effective essay, I have just said that this must therefore get an 8 or a 9. If I go, it's adequate, then it's a 6 or a 7. Which still leaves a question then for some people, well, what do you call a 5? Like, what's that? Because that still passes. A 5 is like the one where you're going, do they get, there's inconsistencies with a 5. So it's, for the most part, is it inadequate, or for the most part, is it adequate? That's a 5. I detest giving 5s, because a 5 is almost like a cop-out. And I won't do this, but I kind of wish we either gave it a 4 or a 6, you know, and that either you have it or you don't. But a 5 is like that gray area where there's just enough that's kind of pushing your way through. And so, you know, Byron was talking about how an AP grader would look at it. The fear is, I don't know what to call this one, so we'll just call it a 5. But they're still pretty good at not kind of falling into that trap. And it's very early. You're going to see a ton of examples of 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s and 5s and 6s and 7s and 8s and 9s throughout the course of the year. So you get a little bit better at recognizing why your 5 is a 5 or why your 6 is a 6 and so on and so forth. The 3 main things that go into an essay score, and this is regardless of the prompt, whether it's rhetorical analysis or some other essays we look at, is there a clear argument? If there is a clear argument, do they have appropriate evidence? And do they have the ability to write well? And this is kind of like those Venn diagrams where those things, you know, all overlap. So if you're doing really well in all of them, chances are it's going to be an effective response. You know, if you have a very good argument and you have very good evidence, but you're inconsistent when it comes to your ability to write well, then you might kind of be taking an 8 essay and dropping it down to a 7 a little bit. The main 2, though, is argument and evidence. And the key to a TWA, especially rhetorical analysis, is can you read the passage, can you understand what you read, and then can you prove that you understood what you read by writing about it. If you read the passage and go, I have no idea what this is saying, then you're probably going to be behind the 8 ball a little bit, and it's going to be a fight to get it up into that passing score. But there is not a, you start at a 9, and for every mistake you make, your score goes down. That's kind of how the SATs work. This is more of you get rewarded for what you do well, and so you kind of bring your score up. It is a rough draft. Understand that. You're not doing a final copy. It is a draft. So there are going to be errors. There are going to be mistakes. A 9 essay is by no means a perfect response. There are still some issues that could be there, but it is sophisticated in its argument and its control of language. The evidence is definitely there. That doesn't mean there's not a comma splice, run-on sentence, misspelling word, you know, from time to time. I think it might have, Allie, were you the one asking me about like the whole 1/3 of total essay score on like Friday, I think, when we passed them back? So I already kind of briefly mentioned this, but just keep in mind, you will have 3 essays that are going to show up on your AP exam. They all are graded or weighted equally. And so when we do have an essay later on that we'll talk about, it's a synthesis. It uses outside sources Those of you who are doing DBQs in APUSH or Euro or did them in world history, you start getting concerned because DBQs are worth so many more points than these other essays. All the essays are worth equal amount of weight to it. So, a 5 on the synthesis is worth just as much as a 5 on rhetorical analysis. The 40 minutes, they just come up with that number because you have 2 hours to write 3 essays. So when you divide it, you get that 40-minute number. You could spend 42 minutes on this one. You could spend 37 minutes on this one and then have 3 more minutes for one of the other essays. How you divvy your time is up to you, but they suggest that each essay receives 40 minutes of your time and attention. Any questions about those things? When I give you a TWA prompt, I put it in this format so that you just get used to it. Now, I think there is a difference between yours and mine up here. This one says 2016. I think yours says 2017 because they just always have the year at the top. This was never an actual AP exam question. It was just one came up with for our purposes. So that's why the year shifts.
Will they have a passage that you have to read for each essay, or is it like 2 essays could be about the same passage?
Your rhetorical analysis, and if there's ever any question as to is this a rhetorical analysis essay or not, 2 things will usually answer that. Number 1, there's a passage. And just to be sure, you'll see the term analyze. The verb is important. What do you do? I have to analyze. What do you have to analyze? Marlowe's description that he uses to characterize Kurtz. So the verbs are very important. The rhetorical analysis will always have a passage. The length of this passage is pretty typical. Some could be shorter, some are longer. They have had, I think of 2 off the top of my head, where you turn the page and there's a little bit more of passage on the back of the prompt. It's actually not a bad thing because it gives you more stuff to pull from. The shorter ones can be tough because there's not as much stuff to pull from. But I'd say 70 to like 90 lines is pretty normal. Like this one's coming up on, I guess, 98. So that's pretty typical. You won't have multiple questions about the same passage. Rhetorical analysis, always a passage. There's an argument question. We're going to take a look at those next week. Call it a DRQ. We love acronyms. Sometimes passage, most of the time not a passage. Just a question and an answer. The synthesis, which is always the first question, is an argumentative question that has sources to help you frame your question and give you context. That's the one that people think of as being a DBQ. They are cousins. They go to the same family reunion, but they don't live in the same house. They're not the same being. DBQs assess your knowledge of the document, of the era, of the context. Synthesis, this is here to help you formulate an argument. And that's really the big difference between this test and I'd say most of the other ones. If you're in APUSH, if you're in physics, if you're in chem, and if you're in calc, whatever, you are taking a content-based test. You have to know certain information to pass the test. Yes, you have to know certain information to pass this test, but there's not going to be questions on what year was John Steinbeck born. There's not going to be questions about who was the antagonist of, Brave New World or any of that kind of stuff. Everything on that exam is nonfiction. Everything on that exam is probably something that you have not read before. Everything on that exam is asking you to use a skill that we've used throughout the course of the school year. So I can honestly say, by November, we've covered all the skills that you need to pass the AP exam. What we do from November to May, and not that it's like all built around the AP exam, we keep using those skills that you will need on the AP exam. So while you're going to hunker down with President Note Cards and Monroe Doctrine and XYZ affair charts and outlines and things like that for APUSH, you're going to pretty much go English test on Wednesday. Okay, excellent. Yeah. So looking at this question in particular, first question was going to be, what do we have to do? We've kind of already answered that. We have to analyze devices used in Marlowe's description to characterize Kurtz. And I don't mean this to sound like patronizingly, nice job. Everyone knew what they had to do so far as SPA, diddles. You could see that framework was taking place. If there was one part of the prompt that people struggled with, any guesses? It was coming up with that, how do you characterize Kurtz? And I might have put a comment in your introduction, but how does he characterize Kurtz? Where you would want to kind of specify what is that characterization of Kurtz. And the way to figure that out is inferring it, from the passage that you're pulling from. People did a very good job of only answering their questions based on the passage. They weren't pulling in stuff that was happening earlier or later. They were just focusing on the text that was given to them. If your thesis statement was, imagery, parallel syntax, and personification characterize Kurtz, I was looking for something to be a little bit more specific as to essentially how does it characterize Kurtz. How is Kurtz characterized, would you say, in this passage? Don't have to get to specific examples yet, but how does he get characterized?
As a man corrupted by power.
Okay, so corrupted by power. Just putting options down here. There we go. Anything else? That could certainly be one. Madman? Like insane madman? Does he? As someone who freely exerts power? Okay. Okay. Anything else? Good options. Again, not saying you had to pick one of these three. Does Marlowe like Kurtz? Obsessed with him? Why? You said corrupted by power, which is like a negative connotation. What would be, and not saying you had to go with this, but what would be a way to kind of word that you can tell he likes him or admires him? I guess, why would he be worthy of admiration? Respects him.
Everyone speaks very highly of him, and not to mention the vast amounts of work that was ascertained through.
Okay, so you have corrupted by power could be remarkable because of his power or something like that. Could be like a slight variation of it. Rhetorical analysis, it's not always just about which argument do you pick, it's about how do you go about supporting your argument. Any of those four things would absolutely work. So, looking within the passage, where do you see examples of certain devices showing up that would support arguments? So, where do you go, that's an example I'm going to use. I'm going to look at Noel just because I see blue. What's in blue? Okay. And I'd say personification was in the top 4 of devices that was used. Patting him on the head. Okay. Mr. Kane? Hey. Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah. 1, 7, nothing. Yeah. Same classes, but yeah, the periods are all different, yes. No, that one wouldn't count. That's not a junior only. Right. So, yeah, yeah. Right, and I would not. Correct, so I'd have the 1, I'd have the 7, but now I would have a 9 instead of a 4 or 5. Yep. Okay, no problem. All right, so we got personification, patting him on the head, embraced him, loved him, all that kind of stuff. Any more examples of personification?
I'd like the whole all of Europe contributed to his.
All of here. That's down here a little bit. There we go. contributed to the making of Kurtz. And then the prodigious laughter, peal of laughter over here with the wilderness was taking place. You did not have to use personification. And some people might have used the personification that Allie's using over here in 73, 74, and they could have used it as metaphor. They could have used it as detail or something like that. So there is certainly some overlap as to what you could call it. Here's one thing that I really liked about the essays. People generally were finding 2 or 3 examples of the personification or whatever device, and they were not over-quoting. They were not taking these big, long passages. They were using short little bursts. They were kind of blending Conrad's words in with their own. And you can do that on the Grapes of Wrath essay. Just because it's 600 pages, 621, doesn't mean you have to use really long quotes for it. You can still quote it the same way that you would from using with the TWA. So personification would definitely be something. What else were people looking at, example-wise?
Parallel.
Okay. Which places, Byron? I have a guess, but...
I started at my ivory, my intended, my iron, my station, my river.
Okay, so that use of my over and over again. Where to go?
It's up to the top left. Maybe in the middle.
24.
Yeah,
There we go. Thank you.
Top left for me.
You can never find it as easily when it's like right in front of you. Did you do anything else then for parallel?
Bye, Mr. Kane.
Yep.
He had withered, it had taken him, loved him, embraced him.
So up here at the top where we had with like that personification stuff. Okay. You called it parallelism, parallel structure. Some folks want repetition, like with the my. Again, what you call it isn't really too important, but a lot of folks were looking at the fact that he repeats over and over something is his, and so you might look at that as, you know, someone who would be exerting that power or be corrupted by power, or kind of becomes insane to the point of he thinks absolutely everything would be his. Folks who used repetition might have mentioned my, also might have mentioned the fact that ivory comes up over and over and over again throughout the course of the passage. So by saying parallel structure, Byron can't really mention the fact that that ivory keeps coming up, but if a person said repetition, went with my, also could then mention the repetition of the fact that ivory keeps coming up over and over and over again. I would say the top 4, and not in any particular order, but of devices that were getting used was imagery, was personification, something with repetition or parallel structure, and then diction. And that would probably be like an ominous diction, a dark diction, different types of terms that had a pretty kind of negative connotation to it. But if you had something like details, that didn't mean you missed the boat. If you had metaphor, that certainly didn't mean you missed the boat with it at all or anything like that. Sometimes, did anyone find a part of the passage where you see something important but you don't really know what to call it? Like, I want to write about that, but I'm not sure what it is. Are there any examples in here where that happened?
That actually really happened more with me for the Grapes of Wrath in my second essay.
Okay.
I had tons of examples, but I couldn't find any rhetorical devices in any of them.
This might not solve that problem, but within the context of this passage, a place where I think there's a pretty significant passage, but people aren't exactly sure what I should do with it, would start off after he had taken a high seat amongst the devils of the land. You know, I mean literally, and people will take a look at devils as being certainly a negative word. You can't understand, how could you? Solid pavement under your feet, surrounded by kind neighbors ready to cheer you or to fall on you, stepping delicately between the butcher and the policeman and the holy terror, going on and on and on, utter solitude without a policeman. What point is he really trying to emphasize in this part of the passage? You can't understand, how could you, because of what? Why is he someone that we cannot even begin to fathom to understand?
Because we haven't experienced what he's experienced.
He's in the wilderness, he's in the jungle, and where are you? London, Brussels, Pittsburgh, pavement under your feet. You have policemen. If you have police, what do you have? Safety, laws, regulations. He's the wilderness. He doesn't have those things. What does he have to do? You have to fall upon your own innate strength, upon your own capacity for faithfulness. Of course, you may be too much of a fool to go wrong, too dull even to know that you're being assaulted by the powers of darkness. I take it no fool ever made a bargain. It keeps on going on and on and on. But basically, he sets up that you can't understand him unless you have been with him or in the same area as him. What's Marlowe doing? We call it C&C. Compare and contrast. What is he contrasting? Your situation with his situation. So again, not that you have to, and I don't think people might necessarily use the term because it's not a diddle statement, but you might decide that imagery and contrast glorify my purpose, Kurtz as a remarkable man. That's my thesis statement. Imagery is going to glorify him. The contrast is going to glorify him. You can't understand why he's a remarkable man because of your place. That would be perfectly fine. Now, again, I'm not saying you had to go with something like this. If you had, imagery, dark diction, and personification expose Kurtz as a greedy, power-hungry, insane madman, you got plenty of evidence in there that would support it. The main thing is making sure the examples that you use go back and support that purpose and the argument. If you simply want imagery and details characterize Kurtz or develop his characterization, I still don't know as the reader what is his characterization. If I don't know that you don't know what his characterization is, then I can't say for sure that you've read the passage and truly have understood it. Therefore, that score probably is going to fall into that 4 category instead of being adequate or effective in that 6, 7, 8. So you want to make sure that the argument is clear. You want to make sure that the evidence is clear. The ability to write, I don't think is going to be too problematic throughout the course of the year. Tomorrow, bring in Bedford readers your questions for shooting an elephant. You want to make sure your name's on your folder, and you want to get it in the bin, not on top of the bin. But on the way out the door, you can simply just drop it.